Mike Donnelly, who is an attorney and a professor of law, and also Ron Coleman, who is also an attorney and a member of the Dillon Law Group and hosts the wonderful podcast, The Coleman Nation. So, Ron, let's start with you. So, this is finally in the hands of the jury after 5 weeks. There are only a couple of outcomes. We could have full guilty, full acquittal. We could have a mixed bill, which I think is probably the more likely potential. This is why a lot of prosecutors really love having multiple counts, because you can kind of please everyone in their opinion. But the prosecution in this instance only needs conviction on one of these counts, and Judge Merchan is allowing the jury to not even have to be unanimous on the underlying crime, which I think is a huge appellate issue. What say you?
This is the least, I want to say the least of the appellate issues, but this case is just a rolling law school exam. It's a train wreck of appellate issues. There's so many levels of preposterousness. Yes, I agree with you. That was my very, very long way of saying, of course, it's an appellate issue. It's not in and of itself an insane proposition, unless you realize that since it is an element of a criminal conviction, it has to be anonymous, unanimous. Certainly should be anonymous. In fact, he might even be doing himself a disservice. When I say himself, I mean the judge who is also acting as a prosecutor in this case, because there may very well be somebody on the jury who will say, you may, 8 of you, or the majority of you have voted that is an underlying crime, but I still disagree, and therefore I'm not going to vote for conviction.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you do have to ultimately have unanimity on any convictions. And if you get even one holdout, which is what Team Trump is, of course, hoping for, that then you would get either a hung jury or, like we saw in, the classic 12 Angry Men, that you can kind of wind your way back from 11 to 1 to, 12-0 saying acquittal. But Mike Donnelly, let's talk about what happens in the instance that President Trump is convicted of even one of these felony counts. As Phil Holloway's post on X mentioned, I mean, this is uncharted territory, and Judge Merchan, even if he granted probation, would still then be able to exercise and exert a lot of authority over President Trump in the middle of campaign season. I mean, what even happens, or what does this look like for a former president with Secret Service security and protection to be jailed?
Well, I guess Judge Merchan wants a new job, Donald Trump's campaign manager. I don't see how the judge
He might be better than the current one, honestly, but okay. So,
well, the Bronx rally worked out pretty well for Trump, but yeah, I don't see how Judge Merchan can jail President Trump. I mean, in theory, he could, but look, the jury's got to be unanimous. There are actually 2 crimes that the jury has to find. They have to find the first crime, which is a misdemeanor, and then to get to the felony, they have to find that there was a crime of falsifying documents, and it's basically the same charge with different documents. So what are they going to find? One document was falsified by Mr. Trump. Like, he's the one who has to actually have falsified the document. So I'm wondering how they're going to deal with that. Secondly, they have to find there's this additional crime could have been committed. And they're trying to point to this federal election charge as a potential crime. So there's a lot of opportunities here for the jury to say, you know what, we're not going to deal with this. We're just going to let somebody else convict President Trump. That's what I hope happens and should happen. If the trial comes back with a guilty verdict and Judge Merchan actually tries to jail President Trump, I mean, we'll elect him as president, and then he'll pardon himself from jail, and then they'll let him out.
Well, but is that even able to be pardoned because this is a state level offense? I mean, wouldn't that have to be through the New York State or, that type of pardon authority? And so, I mean, could we theoretically, Ron, have a president that is run? I mean, the Oval Office becomes like the courtyard of a New York State prison. I mean, this is preposterous, but that's what we're potentially looking at.
Yeah, I think there's no chance of that. This will reach the New York Court of Appeals in the event that the first department doesn't deal with. If Merchan really goes through with his insane plan, which is a distinct possibility, there is a school of thought that he wants to play it out as long as he possibly can. After all, if the jury does the job for him, he doesn't have to worry about being reversed if there's an acquittal. And meanwhile, he can still face all his friends in New York society, not as the guy who dismissed an obviously unlawful prosecution, but as the guy who presided over the absolutely justified and noble attempt to put the most dangerous man since Attila the Hun behind bars.
We're going back further even than Hitler. We're to Attila the Hun,
Hitler's
which
old. Yeah, no, forget.
so yeah, that's old news. Okay, yeah, but let's get to a second story that also deals with President Trump, because he has been out on the campaign trail, and he spoke at the Libertarian Party convention, which to me was a little bit of an interesting play. RFK Jr. also spoke there. Trump put on Truth Social that he didn't seek that nomination because obviously he's running as a Republican, which makes sense. But nevertheless, he spoke at this convention, and which, are the capital L Libertarians, and he actually promised them this. Listen.
And if you vote for me on day one, I will commute the sentence of Ross Ulbricht to a sentence of time served.
So free Ross, and listeners will recognize Ross Ulbricht as the founder of the Silk Road, which was this dark web space that sold all kinds of illicit drugs. He also allegedly took out a hit on an individual. I don't think that actually occurred, so he wasn't charged with murder or attempted murder, but was convicted of a whole host of other crimes related to drug possession, drug distribution, and so forth. In my view, Mike Donnelly, this is using the power of pardon to curry favor with voters, which is not what our founders intended by giving the last full stop of justice, speaking of pardon power, to the executive at the federal level and then also at the state level. And so while Trump is in the midst of his own sham trial, and I think deserves to be acquitted, and this should have never come up to begin with, he's now turning around and suggesting that he's going to use the power of pardon against someone who I don't think deserves it. This guy has a life sentence, and I think he should serve it because of the crimes that he was found guilty of. So what do we do to reconcile what Trump is doing now with what he's suggesting in terms of the weaponization of government against himself?
Well, I think the founders intended that, Jenna, and that may be true, but the president has a virtually absolute authority to pardon and commute sentences for crimes committed against the United States of America. And, we discussed this in the presidential immunities case a little bit. How far does the presidential immunity go? And Mr. Trump is giving us all kinds of interesting legal issues to discuss, testing the boundaries of the Constitution. So this matter has not been tested, even as it relates to state offenses, which you mentioned before. Most people don't think the pardon power goes to state offenses, but has that been tested? That hasn't really been tested. How far does the president's power to pardon and commute sentences go? It looks like we're going to find out.
Very interesting point. And Ron Coleman, so as far as this promise to the Libertarian Party, what's your thought on that? And do you think that these people who then ultimately nominated some other kind of rainbow carrying wacko to be their nominee, are they even going to care?
Let's not yet. Talking about the insanity of the Libertarian Party, not to be confused with libertarians or the libertarian movement or philosophy, is not productive. I think it was an absolutely brilliant move. I think there was no downside for it, and it demonstrated that this is a man who doesn't fear being contradicted, doesn't fear going into the lion's den, can walk on his own 2 feet. I think that politically, no downside. I do think you're asking really important questions, but I do think there is a really fundamental difference between promising to get the government to deprive the government of one of its victims. Reasonable people can agree about whether or not he's a victim or whether he was overcharged, oversentenced. Reasonable people can agree. And promising to lock people up. And remember, last time around, he did promise to
Yeah,
lock someone up
that's
and didn't.
that's a great point, and
And
we've
didn't.
got to leave it there. But you know, the power of pardon, always an interesting topic. We'll be right back with more with our legal eagles.